Last week, I had envisioned what the woman who anointed Jesus with the expensive oil may have felt like. First, I thought she was certain of what she was doing. But then when the people in the room became angry and scolded her, I'd envisioned that she had experienced doubt and uncertainty about what she was doing. This idea of certainty and uncertainty, or faith and doubt, is a really great topic to go along with Passover. Last week, our text had told us that it was 2 days before Passover. This week, we're told it is the first day of unleavened bread, the day when the lamb is slaughtered. We should probably refresh our memory as to what Passover is and why it is so important. In the book of Exodus, in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is what most people call the Old Testament, we learn about how the people that God had called to be his people had become slaves in Egypt, and that God had heard their groaning, remembered the covenant that he had made with them, and that he would rescue them. Now, this rescue wasn't as easy as a few years ago when the popular TV show Friends character Joey Tribbiani described it as Superman flying all the Jews out of Egypt. In actuality, Jewish tradition tells us that it took an entire year for this to come about. First, God had decided to send Moses, a man who really didn't want to go, back to Egypt to be the one to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. That didn't really work out so well because Pharaoh just did not listen, just as God had told Moses that would happen. So God then sent 10 different plagues upon the Egyptians in order to convince Pharaoh to do this. Now, I can never remember what all of the 10 plagues are. But the most important one today is the final one. This is the plague in which all the firstborn animals and people would die. In order to protect themselves, the Israelites put the blood of the slaughtered lamb as a mark over their door and on the doorposts, so that the angel of death would pass over them and they would live. This is what convinced Pharaoh to finally let them go. After they crossed the Red Sea and Pharaoh and his army were drowned in it because Pharaoh changed his mind and chased after them, we read in Exodus 15, "Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." This is what Jesus and everyone else was celebrating in this final week of his life. It was a celebration of freedom, of God saving God's people from slavery, of leading them out of Egypt into the wilderness to become the people they were meant to be. And the main part of this celebration was the meal. It was, and is, because it's still celebrated by Jews around the world today, called a Seder, which means order, because it has a specific order in which it happens. It is at this meal that Jesus declares that one of his disciples will betray him. Remember, last week's section also took place at a meal in which a woman did for Jesus something he said would never be forgotten. A meal which Judas then left and went to conspire with the chief priests in order to betray Jesus. So at this meal today, after Jesus announces that someone will betray him, he then takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and calls it his body. What is interesting about this is that in the Seder, there's a specific time when the bread is broken. It is called yachatz and means half. This piece of unleavened bread is broken in half to symbolize the bread of affliction in Deuteronomy 16:3. You must not eat it with anything leavened. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of Egypt in great haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt. There's also an idea that this broken bread symbolizes that redemption is still incomplete. Remember, they were celebrating the redemption from Egypt at the same time they were hoping for redemption from the Romans. It was incomplete. They were not totally free. And then Jesus described the cup of wine as his blood. During the Seder, there are 4 times when a cup of wine is drunk. We think this one was probably the 4th one. Jesus calls it the blood of the covenant, referencing Exodus 24, 7-8. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, "See, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." That is when God and God's people solidified their covenant with one another. And in this Seder, Jesus mirrors that covenant and makes a covenant with his followers. After they're done with this meal, we're told they sang the hymn, which is Psalms 113 to 118. And then they left to go to the Mount of Olives. If you remember, last week I'd mentioned that with the 11 verses I had to work with, I didn't really think there was enough going on. This week, there's almost too much going on, because now we have a lot of action. We have about 5 different scenes between here and the end of the chapter. 1, Jesus tells his disciples they will desert him, and Peter specifically says he will not, despite what everyone else does. 2, Jesus takes time to pray that the upcoming events will not happen to him, but his disciples fall asleep during this time of distress and despair. 3rd one, Judas brings a crowd of people, including the chief priests and the scribes, and Jesus is arrested. His disciples all run off, including one young man who runs off naked, which is a really strange story for the author of Mark to include. 4, testimony is given against Jesus. And 5, Peter denies Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus told him he would do. That is a lot going on. What is striking to me is that we move from a meal among friends to those very same friends deserting Jesus when it gets down to being a life and death situation. It's become serious. He has been arrested, and now they have to decide if they are still going to be his followers or not. Last week I'd mentioned that many of the disciples didn't really understand or believe Jesus when he spoke about his death. And tonight they still don't understand what he knew, that they would betray him. And even when Peter protested that he would never do this, Jesus tells him not only will he betray him, he'll actually deny him not once, not twice, but 3 times. This is Peter. This is the disciple who Jesus said was the rock on who the church would be built. This is the person who's going to deny Jesus 3 times? This section is full of betrayal. Judas betrays him. The other disciples can't stay awake while he prays. Then they flee, and then Peter denies him. Jesus must feel incredibly alone right now. None of the people who have been the closest to him resemble friends at all right now. Jesus prayed alone. He had his trial alone. At the end of the chapter, after Peter realizes what he's done, well, let's take a look at it. At that moment, the cock crowed for the 2nd time. Then Peter remembered what Jesus said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. He broke down and wept. We have so much emotional pain in this chapter. Right after, we had close friends sharing a meal, celebrating freedom. That's a really big switch in a short amount of time. Here we now have Peter, this man who has realized just what he has done. He's realized the enormity of his betrayal of Jesus, and it has brought him to probably his very lowest point in life, just as Jesus is almost at his own lowest point. I don't know about you, but it can be very hard for me to show emotion sometimes. I tend to keep up a barrier, and I don't often let people know what I'm really feeling. I don't even know the last time I really cried very hard. I don't know if Peter's show of emotion was typical for him or not, but I think that in order for him to break down and weep that hard, he must have been feeling a lot of despair. My friend Andy recently wrote a blog post about some despair he'd experienced in the last couple of years. He'd gone through a lot of pain and life upheavals in a very short amount of time. And finally, the emotions he'd been scared of feeling caught up with him. This is how he described it. Once the tears started, they flowed uncontrollably, and I wound up on my living room floor, rolling around and gasping for breath, as the sobbing came from a place deep in my soul I didn't realize existed. Now, later in our Bible, we will see Peter as one of the instrumental leaders in the church in Jerusalem, so we know he got through his pain. My friend Andy made it through his as well. But it's in the midst of that pain that it can be hard to see a way out. In Andy's situation, he had a close group of family and friends that surrounded him and helped him get through it. And I like to think that in Peter's case, the other disciples, except of course Judas, helped as well. Because they were close. They had been traveling together with Jesus for 3 years. They just celebrated a meal together. That type of intimacy doesn't just disappear. At the beginning of today, I talked about certainty and uncertainty, faith and doubt. And we see that again. We see Peter so certain that he will never deny Jesus, and yet he does exactly that 3 times. It's really easy to think of this meal as something Jesus did with his disciples that we don't really do today. To see it as a holiday we only incidentally know about because we hear about it every year during Lent. But here in this church, we have a version of it every single week. I've been a part of a lot of different denominations over the years, and most of them haven't celebrated communion every week. Most are monthly. I think one church only did it quarterly. Some churches will only do it on the 1st and 3rd weeks. Some places use store-bought white bread. Some use thin wafers. Some use homemade bread. Some churches will use grape juice. Other churches will use wine. When I was a kid, one church that I went to, we had to wait until 2nd grade to take communion. Before that, my sister and I would pretend to have communion by using the breath mints that my aunt kept in her purse. And at our last church, before we moved here, kids weren't usually allowed to participate in communion until they were older. I think it was when they made their profession of faith, which had a flexible age range, but it was often in their probably early teens. And so one of the things that my kids really liked about coming here was that they were welcome to take communion. When we were visiting a lot of different churches, and we asked them what they liked about the places they visited, their top thing with this church and another church was that they were able to take communion. And I liked that they were able to because I liked that they were included and it was not an exclusionary act. Despite all of the differences in communion in all of the different churches, there is one thing that all of these different ways of doing communion has in common. They point back to this very last meal that Jesus had with his disciples. It also points ahead to the coming kingdom. The other thing that it has in common is that even though we all come together for a meal and we all believe that Jesus is present in some way, we are also all betrayers and deniers as well. Because we know that family can be complicated. If you've ever watched a soap opera in your life, you know that family trees are very complex. And even though our real-life families aren't usually that complex, they can have their own problems. But despite that, we still get together for celebrations because most of the time, despite all of our problems, families really do love each other. I love the description of communion that I found in a theology book here in the church library. It says, "We disciples often speak of the Lord's Supper as a gathering of family. But family is never a closed circle at the table set by Jesus. Reading the Gospels, it is impossible not to notice that whenever Jesus sits down to eat, he often does so with people that others say should not be at the table. Tax collectors, sinners, and he welcomes the woman who weeps over his feet at dinner and dries them with her hair. Jesus scandalizes others by sitting down to eat with the unwelcome. If we are to encounter Jesus at our communion tables, we must set tables from which no one is turned away." And so when we look at Jesus' Last Supper and what we do here every week, we see that it is a welcoming meal. Jesus welcomed Judas, knowing he'd betray him. He welcomed the other disciples, knowing they'd desert him. He welcomed Peter, knowing he'd deny him. Jesus welcomes us too. And we welcome each other and anyone who joins us, regardless of what happens the rest of the week or even an hour from now. We share this meal together knowing that we can and probably will cause each other pain. We share this meal together knowing we will experience pain and despair, and also that we will find comfort and love from others. We share this meal together, certain of our faith in Jesus, only to have questions and doubts when we are done. We share this meal together, knowing that it's been done for centuries and will be done for many years to come, as imperfect people living in an imperfect world, with our hope in Jesus and his coming kingdom. We celebrate freedom, not a secular version of freedom, but the freedom that Christ brings us, the freedom to which we are called, the freedom when we are passed over and death no longer has the final say.